Military police said I was too crippled to be a hero until they saw my Medal of Honor. The concrete opened a new wound where the old one still hadn't closed, my stump grinding against the pavement as I dragged myself toward the fountain on my elbows, blood painting thin red lines behind me, like something out of Kandahar instead of a courthouse lawn in October. For one disorienting second, the crowd noise dropped away, and all I heard was rotor wash and Callahan's voice yelling my name, and then a real voice tore through the morning loud enough to snap me back. A voice with 3 stars behind it, screaming a name I hadn't heard shouted in anger since basic. I didn't yet understand that the man screaming it was about to become the only reason I walked out of that ceremony with any dignity left at all, or that the metal box still zipped inside my dumped duffel bag was about to end 2 careers and crack open a cover-up that had been sitting quietly under a base commander's desk for the better part of a year. 6 days earlier, none of this had a shape. It was just another Veterans Day approaching. Another year I told myself I'd finally wear the thing I kept boxed in a drawer, and another year I didn't. I lost the leg in Callahan Reeve on the same afternoon, 11 years ago, in a compound outside Kandahar that our intelligence had rated low risk, 2 hours before the wall came down on top of 6 of us. Callahan had been my spotter since selection, the kind of friend who knew which of my silences meant, leave me alone, and which meant, come sit anyway. And when the secondary device went off under the breach point, it was his body that took most of the blast meant for the rest of the team, while I was already down, already screaming, already missing everything below my left knee before the dust had finished settling. 7 men walked out of that compound because of what happened in the 90 seconds after the wall fell, and I have spent 11 years understanding that surviving something doesn't feel like the word survive promises it will. The Medal of Honor came 14 months later, in a small, quiet room at a hospital in Bethesda, rather than the East Room ceremony most recipients get, because I'd asked for it that way, because I couldn't stand the idea of applause for the day I lost Callahan. I kept the medal in a velvet case in my sock drawer for 11 years, and told almost no one it existed, not because I was ashamed of it, but because wearing it felt like asking a stranger to admire the worst afternoon of my life. My ex-wife, Bridget Farley, used to tell me that silence was its own kind of wound, that our daughters, Piper and Nadia, deserved to know what their father had actually done, instead of piecing it together from a folded flag and a locked drawer he never opened in front of them. She left 4 years ago, not because of my leg, whatever the internet likes to assume about broken marriages and missing limbs, but because she said she'd married a man who used to let her in and ended up living with one who'd sealed every door in the house. Piper hadn't spoken to me in 8 months by the time that October rolled around, not since a Thanksgiving argument neither of us had fully recovered from, and Nadia's calls had thinned to birthday texts. I kept going to the Veterans Day ceremony at Ashdown Memorial Park every year anyway, wheelchair, dress blues, 3 ribbons pinned where the medal itself never went, because it was the only place I still felt close to Callahan. There had been warning signs stacked up for months before that morning, small ones I'd folded into the general noise of being a disabled stranger in public. A cashier at a grocery store 2 towns over had asked, loud enough for the whole line to hear, whether my costume was for a movie. A woman in a VA parking lot had photographed my hand-controlled truck and posted it online captioned another stolen valor faker, tagging a local news station that never followed up. A base spokesperson named Colonel Garrison Pruitt had given a radio interview that September promising zero tolerance for valor fraud after an unrelated scandal 2 states over involving a man who'd bought a chest full of fake medals online. And I remember hearing that interview and feeling something tighten in my gut without being able to name why. I didn't know yet that Pruitt had quietly instructed the young military police assigned to that year's ceremony detail to be, in his exact words according to a memo that would surface months later, aggressively vigilant about anyone whose injuries seemed inconsistent with their decorations. I was, on paper, exactly the profile he'd told them to watch for. The morning of the ceremony was cold enough that my stump ached before I'd even transferred into the wheelchair, and I remember Piper crossing my mind uninvited as I clipped my 3 ribbons onto my jacket, wondering if she still remembered which one was the silver star. I packed the Medal of Honor case into my duffel bag out of some half-formed instinct I couldn't explain even to myself, the first time in years I'd brought it anywhere outside that drawer, and zipped the bag shut without examining why. Corporal Wade Ostrander and Specialist Nico Farrell were working the perimeter that day, 2 military police barely out of their 20s who'd been briefed that morning, according to records that would later become Exhibit 4 in a very different kind of proceeding, on 3 specific categories of suspicious veteran presentation, one of which was described as injury severity disproportionate to displayed decorations. I rolled toward the memorial wall a little after 9, past clusters of families and folded flags, with no idea I'd been flagged before I'd even parked. Ostrander reached me first, tall enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, his voice already carrying the particular disgust of someone who'd decided the verdict before opening the case. He said real warriors didn't roll up pretending, that a silver star and 3 purple hearts on a man who couldn't even stand straight looked like a costume rack, and his partner Farrell started circling my chair with a phone raised, filming what he clearly believed would be his own viral takedown of a fraud. I reached for my wallet to show my ID card, the reflex of 11 years of proving myself to strangers, and Ostrander slapped my hand down hard enough to sting before I'd gotten it halfway to my pocket. He grabbed the handles of my wheelchair and spun me hard enough that my prosthetic knocked against the wheel, and when I gripped the armrests to keep from tipping, he crouched down and told me to stand up and prove I needed the chair at all, like 11 years of scar tissue was something I could disprove in front of a crowd on command. I told him, as steady as I could manage with my heart slamming, that the leg ended above the knee, and he made me pull my pant leg up so he could inspect the attachment socket, actually kicking at it with the toe of his boot, like he expected it to fall away and reveal an intact limb underneath. Farrell dumped my duffel bag onto the pavement and started kicking through the contents, scattering my prescription bottles across the concrete, and when Ostrander picked one up and read the label out loud, he crushed it under his heel in front of the growing crowd, announcing that I was another junkie playing dress-up for sympathy. He unclipped my ribbons one by one and dropped them to the ground, and when he found my old unit's challenge coin in my jacket pocket, he snapped it between 2 fingers without even looking at what it was. The folded flag from Callahan's funeral came out next, and I heard him say he'd bet money I bought it on some auction site before he crumpled it in his fist, and something in my chest went so tight I couldn't get a full breath. The photograph of my unit fell out of the bag last, all 7 of us standing in front of a transport truck 3 days before the blast, and Ostrander held it up for the whole crowd before tearing it into pieces that scattered on the wind. I watched Callahan's face split down the middle and drift toward the grass, and the sound that came out of me wasn't a word, just something low and broken that I don't have a better name for even now. A few of the bystanders who'd gathered started muttering along instead of stepping in, one man suggesting my hearing aid was probably a costume prop too, another saying the scarring on my neck looked more like a chemical accident than a blast wound, and I understood in that moment how completely a crowd can decide to disbelieve a person once 2 men in uniform give them permission. Ostrander noticed my wedding ring and leaned in close enough that I could smell his coffee breath, telling me my wife left because she couldn't stand looking at half a man, that my daughters probably told people I was dead because it was less embarrassing than the truth, and my throat closed around 8 months of Piper's silence in a way that told me some small, exhausted part of me had already started believing him. What happened next took maybe 4 seconds. Farrell stepped behind the chair and kicked the brake release while Ostrander grabbed me under the arms and hauled me up and out, and I went down onto the concrete without my prosthetic properly weighted beneath me, my stump taking the full impact of the fall while my dress jacket tore against the pavement. The wind went out of me on contact, and for a moment the ringing in my ears wasn't memory, it was real, an actual echo of the compound wall coming down 11 years earlier, and I lay there tasting copper and dust that existed only in my own skull. Farrell knelt and unbuckled my prosthetic while I was still trying to get air back into my lungs, and when I reached for it, he was already standing, holding it over his head like a trophy for the crowd, and then he threw it 20 feet into the memorial fountain, where it hit the water with a sound I still hear some nights. I started crawling toward it on my elbows, dragging myself across concrete that opened new cuts across both palms, and that's when the voice exploded across the plaza, a voice that made 200 people go instantly, completely silent. Lieutenant General Desmond Achebe crossed that plaza faster than a man his age had any business moving, close enough that I could see his jaw working before he even reached us, and the first words out of his mouth were my rank and my real name, delivered like an accusation aimed entirely at the 2 men standing over me. He told them, in a voice that carried to the back of the crowd without a microphone, that I was Delta Force, 3 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and a Medal of Honor earned pulling 7 men, including his own son, out of a collapsing compound after an IED took my leg. Ostrander's hands started shaking as he pulled up my service record on his phone, the color draining out of his face in real time, while Farrell backed away from the fountain with my prosthetic still dripping in his hands. General Achebe didn't wait for an explanation. He had both of them in cuffs within 90 seconds, his voice cracking only once, on the word son, and I lay there on the concrete with my stump bleeding, and Callahan's photo scattered in pieces around me, understanding for the first time that the man now kneeling beside me, checking my pulse with hands that hadn't stopped shaking, was Malcolm Achebe's father. They took me to the base hospital where a physician named Dr. Anton Rasmussen spent 40 minutes documenting the re-injury to my stump, photographing bruising that would later become Exhibit 7, noting torn scar tissue that would need 3 weeks to heal before I could safely wear the prosthetic again. Special Agent Thalia Bryce from Army Criminal Investigation arrived at my bedside that same afternoon, laptop open, asking me to walk through the sequence of events while she cross-referenced timestamps against the base's own perimeter cameras, which she confirmed had captured the entire incident from 2 separate angles. What none of us knew yet was that a third angle existed, shakier and closer, filmed on a phone from 20 feet away by a 19-year-old who'd come to the ceremony that morning specifically to see if her father would show up, and who hadn't worked up the courage to approach me before the 2 MPs made that decision impossible. Piper's video, 4 minutes and 11 seconds long, ended up mattering more than either of the official camera feeds because it was the only footage that captured audio clearly enough to hear every word Ostrander said about my wife and my daughters. For the first 72 hours, it looked almost like the system might actually work the way it's supposed to. Base Public Affairs issued a statement calling the incident deeply concerning and confirming both MPs had been relieved of ceremonial duty pending review, and I let myself believe, for about a day and a half, that this might end in something resembling accountability without a fight. That hope lasted until Judith Anwar, a veterans' rights attorney my VA social worker connected me with, got her hands on the actual internal memo Colonel Pruitt had circulated before the ceremony, the one instructing MPs to watch for injury severity disproportionate to displayed decorations. She sat across from me in her office with the printed page between us and told me flatly that Pruitt's language had functionally built a profile that guaranteed a man in my exact condition would eventually get pulled aside, and that relieved of ceremonial duty pending review was the kind of sentence institutions use when they intend for a story to quietly die. 2 days later, both MPs were confirmed to be on paid administrative leave, still drawing full salary, still technically employed, while Pruitt gave a follow-up interview describing the whole thing as an isolated misunderstanding involving 2 young service members who made a serious error in judgment. Isolated turned out to be the word that broke the case open, because it was the one word Agent Bryce couldn't leave unverified. She pulled MP incident logs going back 14 months, and found a name buried in a dismissed complaint from the previous spring, a petty officer named Maricela Duarte, a black amputee veteran who'd filed a report describing nearly identical treatment from the same 2 MPs at a separate base function, a complaint that Colonel Pruitt himself had signed off as unsubstantiated, without ever interviewing a single witness. Duarte, when Bryce tracked her down, said she'd assumed nobody would believe a disabled woman of color over 2 uniformed men, and had let the matter drop rather than fight an institution that had already shown her exactly how it planned to handle her word against theirs. That single buried complaint turned isolated misunderstanding into a documented pattern with a commanding officer who'd known about it and chosen silence, and journalist Delphine Rourke, who'd been quietly building a story since the ceremony, published it under a headline that made the local news cycle explode within hours. For about 4 days, I watched the story do exactly what I needed it to do, watched public pressure force the base to announce a formal Article 32 hearing instead of a quiet internal reprimand. Then the calls started. Unlisted numbers to my home phone late at night, a voice that never identified itself telling me some things were better left to heal quietly, that men like Ostrander and Farrell had families too, that pushing this further would only drag my own past back into headlines I might not want written about, a man who'd asked for a private medal ceremony specifically to avoid attention. A car I didn't recognize sat parked across from my house for over half an hour on a Sunday night, engine off, headlights dark, and pulled away the moment my porch light came on, and Agent Bryce logged the report without ever being able to trace a plate or a name to it. Around the same time, a risk management liaison from the base's legal office requested a private meeting and slid a folder across the table offering a confidential settlement, $60,000 and a non-disclosure agreement, in exchange for my written statement that I'd misinterpreted an aggressive but lawful security procedure. I sat with that folder open in my lap for longer than I'm proud of, my hands finally, actually shaking, thinking about Piper's silence and Bridget's absence, and how easy it would be to take the money and let the whole plaza fade into something I never had to relive on a witness stand. Judith Anwar found me an hour later still staring at that unsigned page, and the sound she made when she saw it was the closest I ever heard her come to genuine fear for me. I didn't sign it. I tore it in half instead, the same motion Ostrander had used on Callahan's coin, and something about mirroring his own violence back onto that piece of paper steadied my hands in a way nothing else had managed in 3 weeks. Agent Bryce's final report, delivered to the Article 32 hearing officer in a folder thick enough to require its own evidence cart, documented everything by then. The perimeter camera footage from 2 angles, Piper's phone video with its clear audio, Dr. Rasmussen's medical imaging of the re-injured stump, the crushed medication bottles preserved in evidence bags, the snapped challenge coin, the torn photograph reassembled piece by piece by a lab technician who spent 6 hours matching fragments, and Maricela Duarte's buried complaint from 14 months earlier, with Colonel Pruitt's own signature dismissing it. The Department of Defense's own award registry, subpoenaed by Anwar's office after Pruitt's staff quietly suggested my Medal of Honor status required further verification, confirmed the citation on record in under an hour, closing off the last thread anyone could have used to keep doubting me. What had started as 2 young men publicly humiliating a stranger in a wheelchair had become, over 6 weeks, a documented institutional pattern with a commanding officer's fingerprints on the cover-up. The hearing opened on a gray morning in a room that smelled like old carpet and coffee, Ostrander and Farrell seated at a table with a JAG defense attorney, who tried, in his opening statement, to frame the entire incident as a good-faith security response that had simply escalated beyond anyone's intent. I testified for nearly 2 hours, walking the officer through every detail from the moment Ostrander slapped my hand away from my wallet to the moment my prosthetic hit the water, my voice cracking exactly once, on Callahan's photograph, and I let it crack because Judith had told me honesty didn't need managing in that room. General Achebe testified after me, his voice steady and furious in equal measure, describing not just what he'd witnessed that morning, but what it had cost his own son to survive the compound collapse I'd pulled him out of. And the room went silent in a way I recognized from the plaza itself. Maricela Duarte testified next, describing her own dismissed complaint in flat, controlled language that made 2 members of the hearing panel visibly react, and when Piper's video played on the courtroom screen, audio and all, I watched Ostrander's attorney's face change as the words about my wife and daughters filled the room in his own client's voice. Piper was in the gallery for that. She'd reached out to Judith Anwar's office 3 weeks earlier, not to me directly, asking quietly whether her footage might help, and the 2 of us hadn't actually spoken since before the ceremony, until she found me in the hallway outside that hearing room during a recess, her hands stuffed in her jacket pockets, asking in a voice much smaller than the one I remembered if I'd known she was there that day. I told her the truth, that I hadn't, that finding out 3 weeks later that my own daughter had filmed the worst afternoon of the last decade of my life had broken something open in me I didn't have words for yet. She said she'd come to the ceremony hoping to work up the courage to say hello, and instead had stood there filming men tear apart everything I'd never let her see me wear, and somewhere in that hallway, both of us crying in a way neither of us had done in front of the other in years. 8 months of silence finally cracked. The hearing officer recommended court-martial for both MPs on charges including assault and dereliction of duty, and separately referred Colonel Pruitt's handling of Duarte's original complaint to the Inspector General's office for a misconduct review that would take months to conclude. Ostrander and Farrell were convicted at court-martial the following spring, both receiving dishonorable discharges along with confinement time, the judge citing not just the assault itself, but the deliberate, documented pattern the prosecution had established through Duarte's buried complaint. Colonel Pruitt was quietly relieved of his command 2 months after the Inspector General's review confirmed he'd known about the earlier incident and chosen to bury it rather than investigate, though the review stopped short of criminal charges against him, a gap Judith Anwar still calls one of the ugliest parts of the entire case. Whether Pruitt ever faced anything beyond a reassignment to a desk posting 3 states away is a question I still don't have a satisfying answer to, and I've stopped expecting one, because some doors in institutions like that only ever open partway. Maricela Duarte received a formal apology from the base, and a settlement I was never given the exact figure of, though she told me once, over coffee at a diner near the courthouse, that no dollar amount was ever going to replace 14 months of believing nobody would take her word over a uniform. I nearly quit twice during those 6 weeks, once with that settlement folder open in my lap, and once at 2 a.m. 3 days before the hearing, sitting in my truck outside the VA with the Medal of Honor case on the passenger seat, seriously considering driving to the base and leaving it on Pruitt's office doorstep just to be done with the entire fight. What stopped me both times wasn't some clean moment of resolve, it was smaller than that. Callahan's face in the reassembled photograph Bryce's team had painstakingly taped back together, 7 men who didn't get a choice about how their story ended, staring up at me from an evidence folder like they were waiting to see what I'd do with the chance they never got. I drove home instead of to the base that night, and the next morning I called Judith and told her I was ready to testify, and that was the closest thing to a turning point this whole ordeal ever gave me. Quiet and unglamorous and entirely mine. A year and 2 months after that October morning, I stood at Callahan Reeves' grave for the first time wearing the Medal of Honor openly around my neck instead of buried in a sock drawer, Piper beside me in a coat too thin for the weather, Nadia on speakerphone from 3 states away because she couldn't get the time off but wanted to hear the wind through the phone anyway. Bridget and I never got back together, and I've made peace with the fact that some things a divorce breaks don't reassemble just because the rest of your life starts healing, though she calls now, sometimes, to ask how the girls are doing with me, and that's more than I had 2 years ago. My stump still aches on cold mornings in a way Dr. Rasmussen says will never fully resolve. A permanent signature of that afternoon layered on top of the permanent signature of Kandahar, 2 scars stacked instead of 1. I still don't know exactly who was in that car outside my house, or who made those late-night calls, and I've stopped losing sleep chasing an answer that may never come, because some threats you learn to live beside rather than solve. What I do know is that the medal doesn't stay in the drawer anymore, and that the next time a stranger looks at my chair and decides they already know my story, I'm not the only one in the family who's ready to prove them wrong.